Welcome to Tiski Sour. Over the last couple of weeks, it's become clear there is a spectre haunting the international financial press, the spectre of millennial socialism. At least that's how the growth in left-wing ideas and support was presented in a recent cover story in The Economist. So in addition to that story in yesterday's Financial Times, Economist declared the future belongs to the left, as liberalism had destroyed the conditions required for its own survival. And the NYT, the New York Times, yesterday published what I thought was a pretty good feature about young socialists in Britain who have been driven to the left by austerity. Novara Media was featured more than a couple of times in that article, which was very nice to see. So what does this mean? Does the recognition in the corporate press show that socialism is now hegemonic? Can the corporate press be brought on side? Can they become allies in the fight for international socialism? To discuss these questions and more, I'm delighted to be joined by the author of that Economist cover story, Callum Williams.
Co-author.
Well, everything in The Economist is sort of written by The Economist blob, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
There's no byline on anything.
No, exactly.
But yeah, you wrote that with someone in the United States.
Yep, that's right.
Aaron, do you want to show the cover? It's a nice cover, right? And of course, I'm also joined by, you know this now, Novara Media's very own fully automated luxury communist, Aaron Bustani.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well.
You
bunged up.
You neglected to say that my forthcoming book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, was also mentioned in the NYT piece.
Oh, they mentioned the book as well?
Well, they mentioned those words in that sequence. The trademark isn't out yet, so...
You haven't... You can't... what's the word? You can't get a trademark on that particular...
The marketing rights. I mean, you probably could get them something on the marketing rights. But why would I do that?
Good point. All right, first question. Callum.
Yep.
Is the future socialist?
It could be. That is the reason we have done these articles. So we basically have done three sort of big things, or two things, big things really. One was this, and then the first, which kind of inspired us to do this, was a big piece in May last year on kind of Corbynism and what Corbynism is and its intellectual roots and, you know, why people who are allied to Corbyn think what they think and that kind of thing. And the purpose of both these pieces really is not solely to sort of come out and say socialism doesn't work, which is entirely what you'd expect The Economist to say, and it's kind of a bit boring. But it's really a recognition that these ideas are gaining currency, and it's also an attempt to do what few other media organisations do, we felt, which was to take these ideas seriously. It's very easy to say, you know, if Corbyn comes to power, the UK is going to turn into Venezuela or whatever that might, you know, there's the classic, you know, trope that people pull out. But we wanted to actually, you know, look at these ideas on their merits, really. That's the purpose of these pieces, fundamentally.
And so what were their merits in your mind? So in that piece about Corbyn, I remember you weren't particularly taken by the fiscal or monetary policy in that you thought it was somewhat unremarkable.
Yeah.
It was just a proposal to end austerity and give the Bank of England a few more instructions with respect to controlling unemployment as well as inflation. It was in terms of structural changes to the economy and particularly democratisation that you thought this could change Britain.
And I sort of realised I didn't really answer your first question, but I guess the main merit of these ideas is that they're popular, right? Because they clearly tap into something that people find appealing. And quite what that is not obvious, you know, on first principles, but there's a lot in there. And I think in particular, this question of control, I would submit, is really, really central to this idea of millennial socialism. The reason we call it millennial socialism, we could have called it anything really. The idea is just to say, you know, these are not simply reheated ideas from the left from the 1970s. There are some, you know, parallels with some of those ideas, but like actually what's been happening in recent years, and that's partly because of people like you guys, and it's partly because there's new think tanks that are coming up, you know, there's people on Twitter and all that kind of stuff. There's a coherent body of new ideas, which is actually very different from what has come before, which has emerged. And so we didn't want to call it the new left because the new left's already a thing. Can't call it the new left because that just sounds, that's kind of dull. So we just thought, you know, there's a nice kind of thing that kind of it describes this body of ideas, and you can see why they're popular. I think control. I would submit the main word to understand these ideas is control.
I hope you just got a shot of Aaron holding the pencil in his mouth. It just looked good.
Did it look good?
It looked good, yeah. All right, let's go through some of the beefs. Obviously, The Economist was, as you say, I think quite rightly, taking seriously these ideas. It wasn't wholly convinced. Maybe we can get up The Economist leader, which is in the script, it's in the first paragraph. So there's a new kind of left-wing doctrine is emerging. It is not the answer to capitalism's problems. So that's putting themselves out there in a pretty strong fashion. So some of the reasons or some of the objections which The Economist puts forward, and so this is the leader that I'm referring to now. So it's sort of, you're involved in it, but this is the position of your paper.
That's right.
Not written necessarily by you.
That's right.
But the issues they have is bureaucracy at any level provides opportunities for special interests to capture influence. The purest delegation of power is to individuals in a free market.
Right. So there's two things there.
Yep.
Which one are you talking about?
Both.
Okay. So I'll take.
The second one is more controversial. So let's go for the purest delegation of power is to individuals in a free market. We all know that bureaucracies can become corrupt.
Yeah. Although I don't think we can come back to the bureaucracy question. I think it's actually a really, really, really important question. But we can park that for a sec.
Yep.
The free market thing. So there's sort of two ways of thinking about that. The first is, bear in mind the institution that's fighting this. This is an organisation that was founded to abolish the Corn Laws, is liberal through and through, centrist through and through. Those things these days are deeply unfashionable. And so all we're doing there really is stating the kind of core liberal capitalist ideas that have underpinned The Economist for 176 years or whatever. Clearly there is a philosophical debate to be had about what makes people freest. Mm-hmm. I think the way to read that is just, it's basically saying, hello, we're The Economist. I wouldn't go further than that.
But I mean, I suppose...
Can you repeat that line, Michael?
So the line, when we're debating specifically the second one,
and
I want you now to really... I know you're not The Economist, you work
yeah,
for The Economist,
yeah.
but put your... They surely have a defence of it beyond just saying, look, we're The Economist, this is our position. So
absolutely.
The sentence we're going for, Aaron, bureaucracy at any level provides opportunities for special interests to capture influence. Uncontroversially true. The purest delegation of power is to individuals in a free market. More controversial, whether or not that's...
Certainly more controversial.
There's a few things there. So first of all, the liberal tradition also includes John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill would not agree with that statement. Okay, John Stuart Mill would say, he kind of, I would say, is an antecedent to very strong socialist arguments now, which say that we agree with liberal ends. Individuals are uniquely placed to decide happiness and who they want to be. We disagree about the means. We disagree about liberal means allow liberal ends. Actually, we think if you value liberal ends, you need socialist means. So certain things like education, healthcare, housing should not be commodities for profit. They should be human rights. And then with fair access to these, human beings can live under conditions of meritocracy and be who they want to be, flourish in a very liberal sense. So in terms of the good life, and we should obviously be constructing the good society towards facilitating, enabling the good life at the level of the individual. I would, I disagree that that's true. I don't think market mechanisms often do that. I mean, they can in some situations, but often not. Secondly, repeat that again. I have another point.
So let's do the second one. The purest delegation of power is to individuals in a free market. You want the first one?
Yeah.
Bureaucracy at any level provides opportunities for special interests to capture influence.
So often writers within the financial press neglect the fact that the firm, the fundamental core actor within capitalist economies, the firm is bureaucratic. They love to talk about markets, they love to talk about the relationships between the firms, but they never talk about firms. Firms are very hierarchical. I like hierarchy. I think hierarchy is good. I think it should be about democratic accountability, recall, competence, right? So I'm not coming at this from a sort of anti-hierarchical position. Firms are supremely hierarchical. They're very rigid, and they're all of the things that I would call The Economist ideologues. Like, I'm an ideologue. I don't mean it in a dismissive sense. They're advancing their worldview, and I think their worldview actually is very much at odds with their misaccount of how the firm operates. And the firm is very much the kind of pivot of the entire capitalist economy. But it's like it doesn't exist.
Well, I mean, there's obviously very good economic reasons for the existence of firms, right? Going back to the 1930s with codes, right? This is well established. So no economist would argue that you need the market mechanism to operate in literally every domain of life. Like, there are good reasons for there to be hierarchies, as you say yourself.
But most transactions take place within those firms, don't they?
Most transactions. I mean, that's an empirical question.
Okay, let's say
I think
that's
also
a large minority of transactions. Then that statement's not true, is
Depends
it?
on how big the firms get, right?
Well, no, like
so
Walmart.
you're talking about
Walmart internalises loads of different transactions. It's a huge firm, or Amazon. It's a huge firm, or Apple's a huge firm. They clearly internalise a lot of transactions.
We've also written at enormous length about how firms these days, particularly large, particularly technology firms, wield far too much market power. So you do have these organisations, we don't need to go through who they might be, who are able to generate gigantic profits, right? And this is, for us, one of the main problems of capitalism at the moment. I mean, just look what happened today with Persimmon, the big house builder, that guy Jeff, whatever he was called, he got paid £300 million or however much it was for the past few years. The UK house building sector, for instance, is fundamentally an uncompetitive thing. So there are firms in there who are damaging the economy, and they are not letting market forces operate properly. We've written loads about that. So I don't think it's right to say that we don't have an idea of the role of firms in the economy. We actually think they're fundamentally important to explaining all the things that have gone wrong with capitalism in the past 30 years.
But that statement seems to neglect. I mean, that statement's almost like capitalism under ideal conditions would operate with, and some people say that, right?
Yeah.
Under ideal conditions would operate with no firms.
Yeah.
We would just have markets.
You can also say there's sort of an internal contradiction in it, right? Because you're saying free markets only bring about a delegation of power so long as you stop the concentration of power within very large firms, which actually means you need a very large state.
Yes.
So even though The Economist has for the last few decades been advocating the shrinking of the state in a very neoliberal system, that can actually undermine free markets because you end up with power agglomerating in these very large firms.
Somebody like Friedman would say we don't need. I mean, some of the people within that school would say we don't need firms. We can have competing currencies. We can have all sorts of mad shit. Which The Economist, doesn't. I don't know. Probably doesn't. Advance that.
No.
I want to go on to the next beef.
All right. Can we come back to the bureaucracy thing though? Because we should talk about
bureaucracy and then I'll do the next beef.
All right.
They're saying turn up Mike's microphone. Turn up Mike's mic.
Oh, just mine.
Just yours.
Just Mike's.
I want to be heard. Cammy, please. Gary's away, so Cammy is on the control decks this evening. So say hi to her in the comments. Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy. This is a question that I have not had a satisfactory answer to from those people who are surrounding Corbyn and surrounding McDonnell and who are coming up with all these kind of interesting ideas. So that statement, I forget the exact phrasing, but bureaucracy can lead to capture or something, whatever that is.
I'll give you.
You give it verbatim,
bureaucracy at any level provides opportunities for special interests to capture influence.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about that, what we really have in mind is plans like Labour's proposals for the water industry, right? So Labour basically says, the socialists of the past nationalised utilities, and the control of those utilities was basically, those utilities were managed from an office with a middle-aged white man in Whitehall. Yeah. Basically, it's very, very top down. What Labour say is that we're not doing that at all. We're going to democratise the water industry. So we're going to take the 9 regional companies in England and kind of give them into the hands of the. I mean, there's some phrase they use. It's workers' representatives, the local community, environmental interests, all that kind of stuff. Our concern, which I've not had a satisfactory answer to, is in practice, who is bothered to go to their local water company on a Tuesday night and talk about metering policy? Most people won't want to do that. They have other things to do. The sort of people who do that are likely to be the sort of people who are politically well connected, close to the government in some way. And so the risk, I'm not saying there's no way of proving this, but the risk that we worry about is that what would end up happening is these water companies basically become another arm of the government. Now, how can you convince me that is actually in fact not a risk? We've put this to people who are very, very senior in Labour, and their answers have been, frankly, kind of a bit bad. So, if you've got an idea,
I suppose answers would be to look at something like co-determination in Germany. So what you've got is you have half the board who are made up of workers' representatives.
Yeah.
Obviously, you recognise there that it's not every worker that wants to be on the management board.
Yeah.
But you have some sort of democracy, which means that you get XYZ people on the management board who have an interest in the health of the firm. And because of the culture, because of the fact that it's actively encouraged for everyone to involve themselves in the union, that doesn't mean that you end up with a load of Trotskyists on the board.
Sure.
I'm not saying that union reps in Britain are always Trotskyists or whatever.
No, of course they're not.
But because in an environment where unions are treated in an adversarial manner by bosses or by the state, then of course they become a space whereby radicalism, which obviously I've got no problem with, but isn't necessarily what you want on the board of your firm if you're a capitalist, becomes dominant. Whereas in Germany you have incredibly moderate people who are sitting on these boards who act a little bit like capitalists, but act a little bit like capitalists in the sense that they're interested in the health of the firm, but they think of it in a more long-term way than would a shareholder in Britain. And you can imagine a similar thing going on with the water, right? So if communities are actively encouraged to take some, it doesn't have to be turning up to meetings, but to take some interest in who's on the water board, then it can become a normal thing to have a look through the brochure very quickly about who you should vote for and then do it online. Even if 10% of people are voting, I can't imagine there's going to be 60% turnout at this thing. But even if it's 10% people, it's not going to be a government stooge, is it?
So you're that's interesting. So you're sort of saying that you think as unions become more powerful, they'll also become more moderate because just because of a sort of selection effect.
Yeah, well, if the state is actively encouraging people to take part in these things, then they should become more representative of society at large.
An argument for that is actually the reason why Jeremy Corbyn even is the Labour leader is that one argument is that trade unions have been so socially isolated that they would have backed him in the 70s, 80s. The trade unions or bureaucracy never, ever, ever would have backed Jeremy Corbyn to become Labour Party leader, and they were very much a conservative force or a conserving force in British society, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Now they're not, and part of the reason why is that they don't really have a vested interest in the reproduction of Britain's economy, fundamentally.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose one place I agree with you actually is I think there is a tendency on our part of the left to say, so in terms of you nationalise an industry or you nationalise a company.
Yeah.
And you say, well, then it's going to become political. And people say, well, everything's political. So it's ideological to pretend that nothing is political. But I think there is a serious question there. And I do think that in organisations like this, you want them to have a very strong constitution, which gives them very much an arm's length distance from the government so that you can't end up with sort of the politicisation of things that don't really need to be political.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, and there are many examples of capitalist firms which are also captured by special interests, right?
Exactly,
so you can't be naive about this.
Which is why the purest delegation of powers to individuals in a free market is potentially more ideological than reasonable. I think probably
one might say
that. Okay, next quote.
All right, next quote.
Rather than obsess about redistribution, governments would do better to. I suppose there's a few things in there. Let's go for. First of all, are the left obsessing about redistribution?
Well, one of the big arguments of the briefing, which is the kind of 4-page piece that accompanies this editorial, which is not so opinionated, is that what we have kind of concluded is that New Labour was obsessed with redistribution, right? But it was obsessed with the redistribution of income. And there's very good evidence that during the New Labour years there was very considerable redistribution of income from which to pull. There's no question about that whatsoever.
And to clarify, I think from all the graphs I've seen, what New Labour did was they sort of stalled the rise of income inequality. Whereas in other countries, sort of like the neoliberal process, which began in the 80s, meant that inequality or income inequality rocketed throughout the 90s and noughties in the UK. It stabilised after New Labour came to power. It never quite reduced.
It's about the same. If you kind of exclude 2009, 2010, because the economy's going off a cliff at that point, it's kind of roughly stable between 97 and 2008. Yeah, it goes up. But
so even though they're obsessed with it, it remains static.
So the best measure of redistribution is not really what happens to overall Gini coefficient, which I think is what you're referring to, but it's really to do with what are the impact of tax and benefit reforms on the net incomes of different parts of the income distribution. And what's very clear is under New Labour, you see the richest people see a decline in their income, a large decline in their income because of the tax and benefit reforms that are introduced. Those at the bottom, so the poorest people in the UK, see a large increase in their income as a result of these tax and benefit reforms. So you're thinking about things like tax credits and all that kind of stuff. I mean, huge expansion of tax credits under New Labour. Anyway, that's a digression. The point is that what I think is now happening is that the left is saying increasingly the redistribution of income still matters clearly, but what's also being talked about now is the redistribution of wealth. So, for instance, this inclusive ownership fund plan, which Labour announced at the conference in Liverpool a few months ago, essentially says every large company has to give 10% of their equity, so 10% of their shares, to workers. So it is a forcible redistribution of wealth. Now, so what we're saying is, in this statement that you've quoted, is that, you know, we think that there clearly is a lot of room for redistribution. However, what the left don't have any ideas about is rent seeking. And by rent seeking, what we mean is what I just said before: companies like the Googles and the Amazons or whatever, who are able to make large profits because the structure of the economy has changed such that they are able to exert huge market power. And so we think that tackling that is as much a thing as tackling redistribution. That's what that's saying.
Oh, so in a way that's trying to be more radical than the left, right? Saying the left are just interested in redistribution of income. We want to talk about redistribution of power.
That's not true. The left's had an account of monopoly capital since Barron and Sweezy in the 1960s. I mean, that's just patently not true. That's patently not true. What monopolies look like, yes, has dramatically changed in the digital economy. Yeah. The left has had a massive account, it had the major account of monopoly capitalism's failings.
That is true.
A half century ago.
That is true. I'm not sure it's such a big theme these days. I'm not sure that Labour has got interesting proposals, for instance, about how to break up Facebook or Amazon.
I think Labour's very... how can I put this?
If it wants to do
it's
that.
very conservative about that. I agree with you, but you look at the IPPR. I agree with that. But I'm saying the left has an account of all that stuff. I mean,
for sure.
I think, by virtue of it, obviously potentially grabbing the levers of power, of state power, it's going to be quite boring on some stuff. IPPR's report, for instance, recently on Facebook and Google, I thought was really good. Yeah. You'd probably imagine that's the sort of policy that, if not adopted over here, you can imagine the Americans or a left French government maybe adopting it. I mean, Macron's made some interesting noise about this, actually, of all the people to do it.
I suppose one point there is it's not really within the sort of the ideological repertoire of Corbyn to talk about breaking up large companies, because ultimately you're talking about increasing competition there, which, although I think that will be absorbed into McDonald's economic policy, it's not really how they make the argument because they're not used to it.
It's not part of Bennett's.
So what they normally talk about is reducing the power of capitalists and increasing the power of workers, and the whole idea of basically breaking up firms to increase the power of consumers doesn't really come into it.
Look, imagine if Labour came out tomorrow and said Labour's going to abolish all mergers and acquisitions between companies, UK companies, if it came to power. That may not be a good idea, but that would be that would show that they were really serious about this. Because
why don't you think they do that? What's your view?
I don't think they do that for the same reason that I don't think they included a commitment in their manifesto for the 2017 election to undo the welfare cuts that were due to take place from 2016 to 2020 under the Tories. By which I mean there are certain policies that are instantly very appealing to anyone. £10 minimum wage, very simple, very easy to understand. Reforming the Competition and Markets Authority.
So do you think, here's a question then, do you think that Corbynism naturally veers towards basically Miliband plus?
No.
And by extension of that, by extension, or let's say, not extension because you said no, but but it's an adjacent question, let's say. Right. Do you think that if Labour were to come into power and were to do all the things they're saying, do you think that takes Britain into the 2020s?
As in, do they get re-elected?
No. Is it a program? Would you say even though you might disagree with some of it, do you think it's a program of modernisation, or do you think they lack the account of what a modern economy looks like to be able to do that?
I think that they.
The Green New Deal is clearly modernisation, right? You might not like it, but it's clearly like quite a new thing.
Yeah, well, I think in a sense that they do have a modern account of capitalism, in the sense that what they have perceived is that people feel as though the economy doesn't work for them and things happen that they don't understand and have no control over. I think, and that is something which Vote Leave perceived and won the Brexit referendum on the back of. And I think that Labour have perceived that, for instance, it's very hard to understand how people in Canary Wharf speculating on subprime mortgages in Florida causes the deepest recession that the UK has seen in 80 years. It's very hard to think through the chain of causality that leads that to this to that. And so I think for a lot of people, quite understandably, they're sort of thinking, Look, I don't want to be involved in that. I want to have control over my life. I want to have I want to have a role in the decisions that take place in the company for which I work. I don't want to get bogged down in the kind of ups and downs that take place with global financial capitalism, all that sort of stuff. So I think that is what Labour have perceived. What I think Labour have not perceived is that on things like competition, they haven't really moved forward, and also on things like the role that welfare, a properly funded welfare state plays in terms of tax credits and that sort of thing. I also don't think their thinking is particularly evolved either. So I think there are areas where they're very modern and areas where they're not very modern, to answer your question.
Right.
I want to go on to we'll talk about those benefits.
Great answer.
In a bit, because I think that's an interesting question. But first of all, I want to pin down one more term in this statement. So to remind us, rather than obsess about redistributions, governments would do better to reduce rent seeking, improve education, and boost competition. I want to talk about what the Economist means by rent seeking.
Yeah.
Right. So first of all, I suppose explain what it means in the Economist toolbook. For the audience, so what is rent seeking?
I think we should have explained it in the piece. My mum, in fact, asked me this exact question when she read the leader. Rent seeking really refers to the idea that a firm is able to sell a good at a price that's well above the cost it takes to produce this good. So, say for instance, if I'm the only producer of beer in the whole of South London, I can go to you and say, I'm going to charge you 10 quid for this, and you have no other alternative, so you're going to pay 10 quid, but it only cost me 50p to produce it. So that's basically, that kind of gets at the idea of rent. And what's happened is there's lots of ways of measuring this, but there is a lot of evidence that rents, in that definition, have increased very substantially, particularly in America, but also here, over the past sort of 20, 30 years. So for instance, there's a lot of research looking at markups. So basically, how much are people these days selling their beer for relative to how much it costs to produce them? And the difference between those two since the 1980s has grown. The Economist is obsessed with this idea because basically what it shows is that capitalism isn't working properly. Yeah. And so we've written a lot about given that that's what's happening, what do you need to do to stop that from continuing to happen? And there's lots of proposals about what you should do. So the reason we mention it there is that you don't really see that discussion on the left. You see that discussion among centrists and on the sensible right, basically.
So I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to go down on this is because the way the Economist puts it, it's very much about product. Yeah. So your example there was beer, and if you have, it's very easy to see how if you have a sort of monopoly of beers, you can sell it for a higher price. Sure. And therefore, the way to solve that is you increase competition. Yeah. Now, how most people will think about rent, and how I think is actually a very useful way to think about rent, is people having to pay a third of their income, or half of their income, or 2/3 of their income on housing. Yeah. And that is a problem whereby more competition doesn't solve anything, because the amount of land which we can distribute, or the amount of land on the market is fixed. Yes. So if the Economist really cares about rent seeking, should they not be in favour of nationalising all of the land and expropriating the landlords?
What we've argued in favour of is not that, but of radical change to planning policy, particularly in London and the South East, which is basically where a lot of, the jobs are. It's the most productive part of the country, and so on. So, for instance, there's this stat which may or may not be true. As in, it's debated as to whether it is true.
Oh, not as in like. Yeah. I can't confirm that anything in the Economist is true.
Which we've not. Well, I think we have used it, but so some people have argued that there are more in the county of Surrey, which is a rich county near to London. People want to live there. Lots of good jobs nearby. Very high salaries, all that kind of stuff. More of Surrey is covered with golf courses than with housing. You've heard this stuff before. And what that really tells you is that the way that planning policy works is that basically it restricts land, the amount of land that can be used to be built on for housing, and is basically a transfer from the poor to the rich. So only rich people play golf. It takes up a huge amount of land. They're very happy, but it means all that golf land can't be used for housing. So what we've argued, and we've argued this not only for London but for places like San Francisco and New York, is that planning policy has to be radically deregulated, and this is supported by a lot of work from places like the NSE, and the evidence would suggest that if you do that properly, you can see very substantial declines in things like rent and house prices and all that kind of stuff.
I suppose the point there, or the critique would be that the Economist there, in terms of the housing crisis, has found one answer which it's very comfortable with. So it's seen that there's a bunch of green fields which are being used for golf instead of housing, and that's because the government have said we're not allowed to build housing on there, but you can build leisure activities, and they've said let's deregulate it. So they've found the one the one example where the thing in their toolkit, deregulation, fits the bill.
Yeah.
But now say you're someone like myself who wants to live within a sort of 10-mile radius of the centre of London.
Yeah.
Now it's not like there's loads of green fields, which if we simply had better planning law, everyone could have a home.
Yeah.
It's that a very small section of people own the land within a 10-mile radius of London, either people who own buy-to-let houses, or if you like the Duke of Westminster in Mayfair or whatever. And the only way that you can stop rent seeking there, these aren't people who've produced anything, they're people who had enough wealth to get a buy-to-let mortgage, and then they get 2/3 of someone's income who's actually working to produce something. These are people who are sitting on wealth and taking money from workers, from producers.
Absolutely.
We need to expropriate them, surely.
Also, it's
Or
not
you
just
can tax them more, which is what we've argued.
Can I just say, it's not just a housing argument, it's also one for business. The biggest overhead for businesses in London is rents, which is just rampant.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely. But you tax these people more. I mean, think about council tax. Council tax was last reformed in 1993.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people in London, particularly baby boomers, right? A lot of them own their homes outright. There's no mortgage to pay. They've got 4 spare bedrooms, and they pay council tax of, like, relative to their income of it's a puny amount. I mean, there's I think it's a Buckingham Palace pays council tax, right? And the Queen pays less council tax than most flats in places like Bradford, just because of the way it works. It's completely crazy.
Again, though, we're looking at tweaks, right? So, I mean, is the Economist in favour of massive social housing building programmes?
That is
council homes.
Well, that is a good question. I think. Well, there's an argument to be had about whether the government should build social housing or whether it should give people the money to afford private rents. So housing benefit.
Housing benefit, yeah.
Yeah. So
a landlord subsidy.
Well, there's a question about the extent to which landlords benefit from it, but I mean, that's clearly an empirical question.
Mm-hmm.
What has happened under the Conservatives is that housing benefit has been very, very substantially cut. Now that, more than anything else, is the cause of the housing crisis in London. So private rents in London haven't increased in real terms, in inflation just in about 15 years.
But you're now going back to that. So I suppose I heard your critique of New Labour as being about they didn't structurally change who had power in the economy, but they were obsessed with redistribution. So what they did is basically they said, we'll leave power, we'll leave wealth, we'll leave property, property to dispose of one's capital as one wishes with the rich, and then they gave poor people enough money to survive somewhat comfortably.
Yeah.
And now you've got a similar situation. So we've got a housing crisis, and you can have a structural solution to that, which is you expropriate or have a very aggressive taxation system, which means that more land comes into the hands of democratically controlled local authorities or the state, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And that gives working people structural power over the landlord. Whereas what you want to go back to is this New Labour solution, which is where you transfer some money to the poor so that they can pay the private landlord who still has all the power, and the next government can quite easily reduce that council tax.
Yes.
So are you not? Should you be more ambitious there?
It's a very interesting question. I think you've happened upon, or you've deliberately argued in this kind of notion that the problem with the redistribution of income is that it can be undone so easily, and that you're not really changing the structure of the economy. I mean, I think that's a good question. I think. I mean, this is kind of
I just don't see how high a housing benefit is really a solution to the housing crisis.
No, what would be more of a solution to the housing crisis, though, is to get London to build a lot more. I mean, this is shown to be a really important factor. I mean, imagine if you could get London to build at twice the rate it currently builds. That includes building more so-called affordable housing, which is I'm sure you'll say is not particularly affordable, which is completely true. You would do that. You would also reform housing benefit. You'd also reform housing taxation. I agree that all of those are quite boring centrist tweaks. I get.
I'm not even saying. I'm not.
I mean,
I'm
they
not
are.
I don't
Totally
want the only argument in favour of my policy to be as interesting.
The problem is that you do, unfortunately, you do need private individuals to invest in the housing market. You do need people to think they're going to make a profit from housing in order to invest in it. That's the thing. Now, I understand that a lot of people will feel that profiting from housing is inherently an objectionable thing. Or
inherently rent-seeking. I don't even mean in a moral sense objectionable. I mean, that's inherently going to lead to rent-seeking if you have private ownership of land.
Perhaps, although, I mean, if someone's making 3% return on their investment as a private landlord, I wouldn't call that rent-seeking. I just call that's almost like buying government bonds. It's not really rent-seeking. if you want to have that situation, you can't just come in and say we're going to expropriate the entire
it's
land
taking
market.
Hold on, Michael. You've said a lot. But they're not just getting the rents; they're also getting the value of an inflated asset. So often, you would buy, and we know the experience of owning property in London over the last couple of decades is you would buy a place. The value of there's properties in London which have increased in value by up to say 2 times the average wage. A property might add £50,000 or £100,000 in a year. In addition to that, you're getting rents whose surplus and what you're paying on the principal through a mortgage is like maybe twice as much. I mean, clearly that's insane. And I know that the economists say yes, it's insane, but that but I mean, obviously anybody would say that's crazy. Even the person who's like doing well out of it will say this is actually ridiculous. But surely you can see that tendency is actually very much at the heart of how any housing market works, where it's left up to private individuals, and the incentives are created for private individuals to make profit from other people living in the houses that they rent them.
I'm not sure. I mean, it's not the case that housing has always become more and more expensive over time. I mean, there have been long periods of history, including in London, up until the 80s, where the cost of living in London was incredibly low and falling. I mean, I don't deny that housing costs in London have gone up very significantly, but there are lots of quite specific reasons for that. And
but that's because London was failing. We've never known London to be a successful city with rents falling.
No, that's true. But the reason why London has high rents is because London is a very, very productive place, and people will pay a lot to come and live in London. Now, that to me, that is not inherently a bad thing. What is inherently a bad thing is when, like you just said, when people are able to extract unbelievably high rents off people who have no power. That's clearly a bad thing. But what we have proposed a number of different solutions for that. I don't think your solution, which appears to be expropriation of land, is a credible solution, because I think the knock-on consequences of that for investment generally would be catastrophic.
No. I mean, I'd admit that expropriating land by government decree would be problematic if we want to run a functioning mixed market economy. But I'm saying to not admit that that sort of an ideal situation, we can have an argument about how we get there, whereby land isn't privately owned and so this isn't just big capitalists. So say, for example, my parents who live in Leighton, their house probably 10 years ago was worth 125k. Now it's worth like £500,000. They're not like the baddies in the economy, but they didn't earn that money, and they earned like about 20 years wage just by sitting in the same place. And for me, that's inherently unjust.
I completely agree.
And that's precisely why a system whereby when London becomes successful, people who happen to own a plot of land in London become incredibly successful has to be gotten rid of. And you can't do that by deregulation. You have to do that by very, very active government policy.
Like taxation.
Do you not think it's a fact? Like, so if you won £500,000 in the lottery, anybody over the last 30 years in Britain would immediately buy a property and make it a buy-to-let. Do you not see that as a massive misallocation of capital? A historic misallocation of capital. If anybody gets surplus funds in the British economy, they put it into housing. They put it instinctively into rent-seeking activities. So clearly we need a decisive, massive response to that, don't we?
So misallocation in the sense that they should be lending it to a small business or something, and they're not.
Yeah, or starting a business or lending it to a small business, precisely. Because the rate of return clearly, in those areas, is nothing compared to rent seeking.
Look, I agree. I agree with that idea. And of course, the increases in house prices is not simply a UK phenomenon. This is something that's happened in the past 30 years in many countries.
So why has it happened?
Well, it's happened for a lot of reasons. I guess probably the single most common structural reason is that cities have gone from places where job opportunities are scarce and crime is high and the quality of life is low, to the opposite. And as a result, people are willing to pay more. That's the most common structural factor. Capitalism hasn't morphed
financial deregulation.
Financial deregulation. So what that people are able to borrow more to spend on housing.
Yeah, and I suppose in the most attractive locations, housing becomes an asset for speculating rather than living in.
I think that is very possibly a question, and I think there is an interesting question that I haven't ever seen being tackled seriously, which is what is the point of mortgages? Mm-hmm. I think that's a valid question.
What do you mean by what is the point? Presumably, if we have privately owned housing, and we have a system whereby renting is incredibly expensive and it makes financial sense to own your own house, what would you replace mortgages with?
Well, people just buy. I mean, you could, in theory, come up with a system where people just buy their houses from their savings. house prices would fall very significantly.
Oh, because they just completely tumble. Because
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not.
presumably they'd all get bought up by the Duke of Westminster now.
Would they? Maybe. I'm not seriously suggesting
Yeah.
we should abolish mortgage. I'm just saying that it's interesting to think through these principles. Like, borrowing to invest in a business has very clear economic rationale in the sense that, like, it will generate income which you can't currently generate now. It's not quite the same thing for buying a house, which doesn't really generate income in the same way. But as a side point, I mean, I think the changes that have taken place in the financial system since the 70s also play a role. All I'm saying is that, as I said before, we are obsessed by, and the Economist, about the high cost of land, because the impact both on the economy as a whole, so the level of GDP, and the way that GDP is distributed among the population, is really, really bad. There's no question about that. I just think that the proposals we have are different from yours, and I would argue they're based more on evidence than the other ones.
Can I ask a question? So,
Yeah.
do you think government debt is bad?
Do I think government debt?
I'm not sure. It's not a playing game. I just
No,
want to
sure.
Do you think government debt is bad generally?
No.
Okay, that's okay. I would expect you to say yes. No, I would, right? Because then, ergo, government assets would be good, right? So if you think government debt is bad, government assets are good. And what I don't quite understand, and you've not said it, so I'm not going to ventriloquize you and say you have, is that there's this argument which says, oh, well, all these things cost the taxpayer money.
Yeah.
They're not revenue generating.
Yeah.
And there are areas where clearly the government could generate revenues, like through social housing.
Yeah.
And yet it doesn't.
True. I mean, the experience of the UK's building of social housing is clearly not a revenue raiser. There's no question about that whatsoever. I mean, imagine if we were if a Labour government was to nationalise water, it could be a revenue raiser for the government. My guess is that it almost definitely wouldn't be, because the whole point of nationalising water is because water bills are too high. So you cut water bills.
That's a low return game. But housing, we know, we've been saying housing has generated quite decent returns over the last couple of decades.
Yeah. I mean, my guess is that probably won't. I mean, mathematically that can't continue forever, right?
Yeah.
So at some point it has to stop. I not with no particular insight into this, I would have thought that probably in London it has probably reached its peak. I mean, London house prices have been falling in real terms for about 3 years. I mean, I don't think the UK government should do a punt on the UK housing market.
I suppose the other point there, though, in terms of I didn't know that historically housing was never a revenue raiser. I mean, sort of picking facts from the air, I'd guess that was potentially because it takes a while for building an asset to bring about a return, and because Thatcher sold them all off at subsidised prices, those flats that were built in the 50s, 60s and 70s were never able to become profitable.
Possible.
But I'd imagine that even if you didn't have an insane economy whereby, you know, house prices are increasing 10% a year, and housing became just a stable asset, that it would make sense for local authorities to be investing in flats which would accrue an income for 50 years.
Yeah, even if it's like 0.15%, it's still, if you have millions of homes.
But that means you're proposing that the state profits from people who need to rent from the state. So the people who have the lowest incomes, the state's going to profit from them.
Well, what the state would do is how council housing should work. Is they set an income, it rises in line. Not an income. They set a rent.
Yeah.
It rises in line with inflation.
Yeah.
And they will keep accruing that rent. Forever. Or until they have to build a new home. So it won't be once. Obviously, you won't have a situation where, as soon as a tower block has become profitable, the individuals in that tower block will stop paying rent. You'll have everyone in that tower block paying a set amount of living rent every week for the rest of eternity until that tower block's knocked down. And after, I'd imagine, because this is why private landlords do it, this is why property developers do it, I'd imagine that after about 10 years that becomes pretty profitable.
I mean, obviously, you're leaving aside the depreciation and the repair costs that come with that. Okay, but even if we leave that for one side, I mean, do you seriously think that a Labour government is going to say, I mean, isn't it great we've got all these people living in tower blocks because we can make loads of money from them?
I think that would be a good argument. Well, I
Really?
think with the argument...
You've said it before.
The state's
Yeah,
supposed, wait, but the
that's a
state's,
great argument.
But the state is supposed to redistribute from rich to poor, not take from the poor and give to the rich.
Yeah, but what you're seeing there... So what you say to anyone, to the electorate, to a voter, is you say, look, you can either pay... You agree. We know from 2015 that you want the state to be financially sound.
Yeah.
So you can either spend 2/3 of your income subsidising some lazy fucker in Kent who's doing nothing but happened to be lucky enough to have the wealth to get a mortgage on a house in Brixton.
Yeah.
Or you can pay 30% of your rent.
Yeah.
And after 10 years, that will start accruing to the government, which we can then spend on education and
Yeah.
the services which you value.
Yeah.
To me, that's an incredibly powerful economic argument, which only falls down if you have this ideology that it's only if the state is making money off a renter that it's a problem, whereby when
Yes.
it's a private property owner, it's not a problem. And,
No,
and
I
to
see
me,
your
that's
point.
sort of like an ideological distinction that doesn't really make sense, and I don't think the
Yeah.
voter would recognise either.
No, exactly. I mean, if it can be shown, if the Labour government could, come up with some plan that would say kind of what you've just said, and it seems credible, I mean, that wouldn't be something that we would oppose out on principle for sure. My sense is that it wouldn't work like that in practice. That's what I think.
I mean, the state has auctioned off rights of access to private actors multiple times and made loads of money off it. If you think about 3 and 4G spectrum in this country,
Yeah.
So like the idea that the state can't make money is obviously not. It's like an ideological affirmation. It's just not true.
No, I just don't. The idea of making money off the poorest people who need to have state subsidised property strikes me as wrong.
But it's the thing is that because the logic is on the left, the argument would be one of solidarity,
Yeah.
whereas the argument you're making, and it's an internally coherent one, is one of charity. So the economy exists so that the rich can help the poor. We're saying you'd want to generally transform overall relations of
Yes.
production so that
Exactly.
you don't need that dynamic anymore.
Council
Absolutely,
homes would no
absolutely,
longer be
absolutely.
charity. Council homes are
Yeah.
an ordinary renting option for citizens of any
Exactly.
class.
Well, I guess this goes back to the central idea of this whole strand of thought, right, which
Yeah.
is about ownership.
Yeah, exactly. And,
Yeah.
and so that redistribution isn't about charity. What we're looking at is creating an economy whereby people are structurally
Exactly,
equal and whereby
yeah.
renting off the state is no longer seen as something for the poor to do.
Yes, I see that's the idea for sure. Yeah.
I suppose to move the conversation on.
Yeah.
I know you can't give me a definitive answer
Yeah.
because you're not the editor
Yeah.
of The Economist. What would it take? So actually, to preface this, we've got a Tory government where we've had a cabinet member saying "fuck business."
Yeah.
We've got a Tory government which is sort of playing with fire and threatening a hard Brexit to
Yeah.
try and basically hold their party together. What would it take for The Economist to print a leader in the run-up to any snap general election whereby they encourage their readers to vote for John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think the boring answer would be these two, like Corbyn and McDonnell, are not fit to be the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, which I know is a view that is held by many people. I think that's not the kind of answer you're going for. You're.
No, I mean that's an interesting answer.
I mean, yeah. So I guess that's
it's
one
also
answer.
the answer I'd expect, right?
Yeah. I mean, but my sense more is that your question is more about the ideas or the policies, like no deal Brexit or Corbyn is kind of the underlying.
They'd go
question,
for no
I
deal
think.
Brexit, right?
I mean, I think that is not something that I can say I know for certain what we'd argue, and I think there are certain news organisations where I say I know what that news organisation would say.
If you were promoted to the editor of The Economist, what would Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have to say for you to be comfortable getting that magazine with its history, with its tradition, with its sort of status in the corporate world, to back John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn? Is there anything they could do?
It partly depends on their policy on Brexit, I suppose.
So if they're just saying Remain or soft Brexit or something which is basically a continuation of the status quo when it comes to trading relationships with Europe, which is basically their position now.
Yeah. I think at that point,
what would they have to drop? I suppose.
What would they have to drop? I mean, I think the again, leaving aside this question of the shadow manifesto, which I think is a bit of a red herring. I don't think there is a shadow manifesto unless you know differently. So I think, as in, what's in the Labour
what's the shadow manifesto?
So there's this.
The idea that they're more radical than
There's
publicly
this
say.
kind of right-wing
Okay,
meme that actually what Labour have put in their manifesto is not what they actually want.
I hadn't even seen that meme.
I mean meme in the kind of old sense rather than
No, I don't mean I haven't seen that meme on Twitter. I just mean I didn't know there was a discussion about a Labour shadow manifesto.
Absolutely. I think
that's what people are talking about at the water cooler in The Economist.
Well, The Economist not right wing.
What's really
just
in
don't
their
forget
plan? Okay, all right.
I think it would be. I think it would probably be the manifesto that I think if the manifesto that Labour put forward for the 2017 election, which is not the manifesto they would put forward now, were put forward again, and they had a clear policy on Brexit, I think the Economist would look at them very seriously.
So you said that would mean they'd have to drop. The only things that have been announced between now and then is the 10% workers fund, whereby
That's the
workers
biggest thing,
own 10% of their company.
Yeah.
The Economist wouldn't like that.
I think for an economy like the UK, for the government to decree that 10% of these companies' equity was forcibly transferred from one party to another is quite a big step.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really big step. There are ways of achieving those goals via the tax system, which are perfectly legitimate. I think the plan that is being put forward is pretty radical.
Too radical. Even if it's done slowly, isn't it 1% a year?
It's
or
1%
something?
a year.
But what if it was successful? Then it goes to 30%, 50%. I mean, that's I've heard leftists like talk about that favourably, and so you can understand why as a like you say as a sort of it's a really giant step, which wasn't appreciated.
It's funny because
by some people.
You often hear people say this is a very radical proposal, and people say, no, look, it was proposed by the Swedish Democrats in the 1980s in the form of the Marginal plan, where they said, well, very similar to this, that they'd transfer ownership of firms to trade union funds. And they didn't even put a 10% limit on it. But that was precisely the point where business mounted a very effective counterattack, and the Swedish Social Democrats ended up being completely neutralised. Because they became kind of isolated. I think they maybe ended up with sort of 7% worker funds, but controlled by sort of quite distant asset managers
more than
who
I
are
do,
connected to the trade unions.
But
anyway, it doesn't seem like this has happened before. So it's a radical proposal. I think it's worth a punt, even if it doesn't get us the leaders section in the Economist before the next general election.
What was that quote from the Institute of Directors the other day?
Bags packing or something, wasn't it?
No, but it was about we've lost all confidence in the political process.
Oh yeah. No, that's big. Yeah.
So I generally look at the establishment in this country as like the Economist, Financial Times, Institute of Directors, CBI.
Yeah.
I mean, is that something that the Economist thinks? Because you're saying like running a leader that's pro Corbyn, pro McDonnell. Is there generally right now a kind of like we just have no confidence in the whole process?
Well, I mean, bear in mind that we endorsed the Lib Dems at the 2017 election.
Wow.
At the 2017 election.
That's crazy.
That's kind of embarrassing, though, for a sort of.
Why is it embarrassing?
Well, just I suppose you don't have the same.
You don't have much choice.
Because I suppose like the Murdoch press, they really care as a prestige issue about backing a winner.
Yeah.
Whereas the Economist, you don't care about backing.
Well, I mean, read the leader. The leader acknowledges at the very top that they're going to get totally thumped, but it has a justification for doing it nonetheless.
That's very brave. I commend that.
Better than endorsing the Tories. I mean, the FT endorsed the Tories.
Yeah.
Right, we didn't do that. So
because I think the FT did the thing of even though they're super anti-business, Labour are even worse.
Which is crazy with the hard Brexit stuff. It's crazy.
Well, I think the CBI would probably agree. I haven't said this yet tonight, so thank you for watching Novara Media. There are almost 1,000 of you watching. We want to get it up to 1,000 before the end of the show, so please share this on Facebook, share this on Twitter, give us a like. It means that it appears in more people's YouTube feeds, and of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to Novara Media on YouTube and click the button so that you get notifications every time we go live. Of course, Disky Sour goes live every Tuesday at 8 p.m, but sometimes when there's an emergency situation, when something big happens in British politics, we will have an extra unannounced show, so it's always good to get those notifications. If you already donate to Novara Media, thank you very much. You are what makes this possible. You are why we can grow in 2019. If you don't already, please go to support.novaramedia.com. As you know, our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can keep working around the clock. I'm going to start collecting questions. So put your questions in the comment, but that doesn't mean that you can't ask a question first, Aaron.
Can you ask a question?
Can I ask a question?
Can you ask a question? You're obviously you're sort of the interviewer, so I'll use you as my interlocutor.
What question do you want me to ask?
Yeah, so I think we have to ask a question generally about like the TIG, surely.
Yeah. Okay, go on.
Given we're talking about centrism,
you ask a question. I'll get some questions from the comments.
Or is it now been?
I'm handing over.
Or as the independent group, which is its acronym is the TIG, or as it's been rechristened by a noted leftist Twitter account, thousands of Iraqi graves. It's the TIG. I thought that was it Rob Delaney?
Potentially, I don't know who it was.
I thought it's not funny. Obviously, it's quite macabre and sad, but yeah. So you've said that you backed the Lib Dems in the last election. Let's say
the Economist backed the Lib Dems.
Yeah. Sorry, you plural. Yeah. The TIG, the Economist backed the Lib Dems in 2017.
Yeah.
Can you foresee a situation where the Economist backs the TIG?
If they're running as a party.
I'd
say that's. I mean, I can definitely foresee a situation. In which
it's highly plausible.
Yeah.
And how plausible do you think that is?
I guess there's two questions there. How plausible is it that they become a party, and how plausible once they become a party is the Economist to back?
I mean, if they had like a TIG Liberal alliance, you'd clearly back them, right?
Yeah,
clearly.
Yeah,
but let's just say in and of their own.
I see. Over the Lib Dems.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the Lib Dems have been
Suppose
slightly
problems for Lib
underwhelming.
Dems,
Have
right?
been slightly underwhelming since the 2017 election. It's fair to say.
Yeah.
So, having said that, the people that have broken away from Labour are not the most impressive people either. So there's a problem there. I would have thought that it's quite possible that we would nonetheless endorse them.
Because I can see the space in Britain. It wouldn't do very well electorally just by virtue of our electoral system. You can see it doing very well in polls, and you can see again millions of votes for a kind of like a very centrist, moderate party, pro-business, socially liberal, charismatic leadership, lots of money, lots of celebrity endorsements. You can imagine that doing really well.
Yeah.
And then I see the TIG and I think, what the fuck went wrong?
Yeah.
You know, I see Mike Gapes at a Nando's. I'm like, surely this is not what the Institute of Directors thought would happen. This is not the lifeboat option. But anyway,
I did think it was quite funny that Labour came out in favour of the second referendum. It does slightly annihilate the point of the TIG.
Good segue. Oliver Haynes asks, was Labour right to back a people's vote? Let's go to you first, Aaron. You've been against it for a while.
Have I been against it? I've honestly not had a particularly original position
I'm
on
exactly
Brexit for quite a long time.
About whether we have a people's vote or not. Do you know what I mean? I think do whatever is electorally useful.
You know, I think the fair compromise is. I think the fair compromise is a soft Brexit, and I think it's a fair compromise in a number of ways. It gives both parts of the electorate something that they want. It can actually get through Parliament, unlike a hard Brexit or unlike a Remain thing. So that's always been my position.
So would you vote for Theresa May's deal?
No, I don't think Labour should do that because it makes implementing the manifesto impossible. That said, I think here's the thing: 60% plus of Labour MPs are in Leave seats, and I can see why they would be tempted to do it. I'm not saying they should do it, but I can see why.
Yeah.
Because clearly, by their own constituents, anything else will be viewed as treachery and a betrayal. And there's not much they can do about that. So that's why I thought Labour's position of the soft Brexit deal was the fairest. I think if Labour comes to be seen as the party of Remain, I think it's going to be a really big fuck up. But it may also be the least big fuck up because right now, obviously, all the parties are confronting major, arguably existential. Well, not arguably, they are confronting existential challenges. Both parties hemorrhaged some members last week. So I think it's a very bad idea. But then, what does that mean these days?
I personally backed it this week when it was announced. I think probably the honourable thing to do would have been to have it out with the Remainers in Labour's base and say, look, you can't always get what you want. There was a referendum and you lost. And democracy trumps whatever argument you give to us about the fact that the economy will grow at 0.5% slower rate for the next 10 years. That doesn't trump democracy. There was a decision made and you have to get used to it. Sorry. And though we as a party will set out to represent you as much as possible, this is a red line for us and you're going to have to deal with it. I think they didn't do that for electoral reasons because they think that would have given sort of like a free rein for a pro second referendum party to gain in support. And what they then did was basically lead on Remainers. So they sort of said like, oh, maybe we'll have a people's vote. Maybe we'll have a people's vote.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I think after a year of that, and not having ruled it out all the way up to now, given where we are, I think probably backing it is actually the most honourable thing to do, especially as it probably won't happen because there isn't a majority in the House of Commons. And I think in a way this can move the debate.
You think that's the calculation?
I think the calculation is that there probably won't be a people's vote. I don't think Labour really want one to happen. But I do think at the same time that doesn't mean we should interpret it in a purely cynical way, because I do think that political parties aren't just there to behave in their national interest, they're also there to behave in the interest of their constituents and to respond to movements. There was quite an impressive movement demanding that the Labour front bench do everything in their power to try and get a people's vote. I think the Labour front bench have been quite clear to say we probably won't. But now I think they can say, look, okay, we probably won't, but we'll do whatever you want us to do. In the next 2 weeks, we'll try and have a people's vote and let's see where it gets us. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position, to be honest.
Yeah.
What do you think, Callum?
Well, electorally, it might be quite good for you for the party. I mean, the drop in support for Labour in recent weeks, or apparent drop. These polls are obviously very volatile. It wouldn't surprise me if that was down to some perception that the Labour was, backing a hard Brexit or whatever. And I do think there is a lot of evidence, kind of as you alluded to a second ago, that a lot of people supported Labour at the 2017 election, partly because if they didn't see the party as the party of Remain, they saw them as the sensible Brexit party, or they had a sensible Brexit position. So now that the party has kind of regained that crown, those people may well come back.
I think one difference, which is potentially sort of understated, is that the difference between 2017 and now isn't so much that then people thought Labour was the party of Remain and now they don't. It's that now a lot of people who were resigned to the fact that democracy happened, we have to leave the EU, have now been riled up very successfully by the People's Vote campaign, by The Guardian, by all these people saying, look, you don't actually have to have Brexit, everyone was stupid, this is such a clusterfuck that you get to remain if you want. Why resign yourself to something you don't want? So I think because we've had 2 years of riling up those Remainers, they now behave in a very different way to how they did in 2017.
Did you see Farage when he was asked about if there was a referendum on May's deal versus Remain?
He said he'd go on holiday.
I think that's really revealing. I mean, that's really revealing because Farage is a fighter, if nothing else. So he would presume that you could discredit the whole process with a very low turnout.
Yeah.
And you probably could. But you know what? That's not really going to stop the establishment. The establishment wants Remain. We've talked about this time after time. Brexit is very much a schism within the establishment, but the Institute of Directors, the FT, the Economist, these people all like to stay in the European Union. They don't mind if the turnout goes from like what it was 72% to like 60%. That's fine.
Yeah. And the outcome is, I mean, it's almost depressing to say in a way, but the most likely outcome of a referendum where it's May's deal versus Remain, I don't want this to happen, by the way, I don't think it will, is that the people who voted Leave who hadn't turned out for general elections for decades, that's what won Leave, that there was 2 million people who don't normally turn out at general elections but finally thought they had something to vote for.
Yeah.
They will basically resign themselves to not being particularly politically engaged, or will potentially have a Brexit party that won't make much impact on election results because of our first past the post system. But none of the parties really want those voters to be in play. I think the two major parties see those voters as a nuisance.
Yeah.
So Labour sees working class Leave voters who are anti-immigration. That's not all working class Leave voters, but that's one big constituency of people who voted for Leave. They see them as basically an awkward group of people in society because they're worried they'll swing to the Tories. They'd prefer them to stay at home, and the Tories are exactly the same. The Tories, most people in the Tories, or the sort of the establishment Tories who are connected to the CBI, etc., who represent business, they also would prefer those voters to just not turn out because they don't want a leader who has to do the whole red Tory sort of like we'll do some redistribution but we'll be quite closed off to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So the liberal people in society who have the most control, I don't mean like liberal in the broad sense of, they love migrants, but they want us to be a fairly open economy with private markets being dominant. They want those 2 million people to be disengaged from politics. I think they'd see that. And I think people on the left and the right, I think people in the Labour Party and the Tory Party would see those 2 million people staying at home as not the end of the world. They're also the people that, I mean, again, to say very depressingly, many political operatives are sort of waiting to die. Because they think that they are a previous...
Not even waiting, I'm fucking... What's it? Polly Toynbee wrote an
Polly
article
Toynbee
about
sort
it.
of like celebrating the fact they're about to die. But they see them as, we don't want to base a party strategy on appealing to these voters because this cohort isn't going to be alive forever. But at the same time, if we don't appeal to them now, that fucks up our electoral prospects for the next 10, 20 years. So if they were just to sort of go a bit quicker, that would be handy if you're a party strategist. So I mean, I think that's why... The negatives that someone who cares about democracy would perceive for having a second referendum would be perceived as an advantage by many of the political.
Can I just quickly say something? And I'm butt out because we've got a great guest. But I mean, Labour wants to get it wants to get turnout massively up, right? And it would need to get turnout massively up in order to win an election.
But by Remainers, right?
But or BAME people, young people, sort of traditional Labour voters in working class areas, which would include some of the people you just talked about, but often not in like the east of England. Or the northwest, so as in northwest, Cumbria. So, yeah, I think that's a really astute point. Actually, that's a really astute point. There are huge incentives for both major parties to effectively, sort of try and inhibit these people from voting again for pretty much anything.
All right, I'm going to do quick fire. And then I think we'll end the show.
All right.
So, I mean, I don't have a timer, but you're going to have about 30 to 60 seconds to answer each one.
Okay.
You're putting yourself in the shoes, or you're putting yourself semi in the shoes of yourself and semi in the shoes of the Economist leader writers.
Okay, one shoe each.
What?
Doesn't matter.
One shoe each. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, you threw me there. 4-day week.
Very interesting idea. If you move from 6 days working to 5 days working, why can't you move from 5 to 4? I think part of the problem in the advocacy for the four-day week has been the kind of economic analysis underpinning it, which essentially boils down to we can be just as rich as we are now, but work for 20% less. I don't think that's true.
So you think the politicians would have to make an argument
Yeah.
that you have to accept a lower material quality of life,
which
that's the decision
is a totally legitimate decision to make, but I think you have to be honest about that.
Okay, you're also going to get 30 seconds to respond to each of these quick fires.
Oh, okay, great.
Go on.
I think sort of neoclassical economics traditionally has an account of utility which is at odds with leisure time. It looks at leisure time as like potentially lost utility where you could have been creating value. So I think the bias built into their models is that a 4-day week is inferior to a 5-day week.
Okay, AOC's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's 70% marginal tax rate on the highest earners.
So this is a kind of more extreme version of what Labour has proposed.
Yeah, which is a 70% marginal tax rate on people earning, I don't know what her figure was, over $100K or something.
I would. The main problem, I think, is that people think it's going to raise a lot more than it would. This is exactly the same problem with Labour's plans for high rate taxation. The IFS has been very clear about Labour's plans, which is that it could raise a little bit of money. It's just as likely to raise nothing. I think to build an entire democratic socialist strategy on taxing the rich is not possible.
So you think you have to have a difficult conversation with the public to say we're going to have higher levels of tax across the...
Yeah, I think so.
Aaron?
I partly agree. For instance, like a national care service, ageing is really under discussed as a crisis of the 21st century. You will not be able to fund a universal care service with the same principles of the NHS for an ageing population by taxing the top 5%. Yeah. You can in the next Labour manifesto, you can do lots of really great stuff for like 20 billion, right? And you can maybe just touch the middle class a bit, but in terms of the long-term structural transformation of the economy, climate change, ageing, maybe automation, that's I agree.
Green New Deal. Should America be spending a few trillion a year on greening the economy, including a reasonable basic income and free healthcare for all?
So I have two things to say to that. The first is there's obviously the question of whether it's fiscally possible. As I said to you before we started the recording, the American economy is already running very close to full capacity. A massive fiscal expansion like that, that's a risk, right? There's a risk of runaway inflation and that kind of thing. So I think that's the first thing to say. And there's the question of whether you can pay for it. There's another argument that the Economist has written about, which essentially is a kind of political economy justification for the Green New Deal. And essentially what it boils down to is, in order to affect radical change vis-a-vis the climate, what you can't do, this argument goes, is rely on the stuff that economists normally talk about. So like basically taxation of externalities, so taxation of pollution. The reason why you can't do that is it kind of goes back to the thing we were talking about before, which is that can be undone very easily by lobbyists. So the government changes and the lobbyists come in and they say, that tax that you progressive government put on petrol or whatever, get rid of that because we don't like it. The political economy argument for the Green New Deal is that what you actually deliberately want to do is to create basically interest groups, lobbying groups that are in favour of you, not in favour of fossil fuels. So in other words, you create loads and loads of jobs in renewables and all that sort of stuff. And even if they're not that productive, it kind of doesn't matter, because what they'll do is they'll have their own lobbyists who will argue very, very strongly in Washington to keep renewables going for, decades and decades and decades. And so in the short term, you have a bit of a cost because you create all these jobs that aren't particularly good and it costs loads of money and blah, blah, blah. But the long-term effect is you save the planet. Now, I don't know what I think of that argument, but I think it's a very, very interesting argument, and I think it's a compelling argument in favour of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, I like that. So the idea being that, I mean, what everyone says in terms of policy terms or politics terms is that the effects of climate change will be distributed very widely and in the future, and it's very difficult to mobilise people on that basis.
Exactly.
The benefit of the Green New Deal is it creates a bunch of people, potentially millions of people, who are structurally incentivized to back green policies in the here and now.
So you deliberately create vested interests. Now that sounds like a bad thing, and it normally is a bad thing. Potentially in this case, it's not a bad thing.
Aaron, Green New Deal.
No, I agree with that. I mean, you have to understand the threat of runaway climate change is very real and it could happen this century. So we can't stop climate warming, but we can certainly limit it to, say, 2 degrees. And the worry is if it gets to 3 degrees, it can go to 4 degrees and 5 degrees and 6 degrees by virtue of desertification, methane hydrate, all sorts of things. So we do need to act decisively. And I think the only agent that can do that is the nation state. So I would agree. And furthermore, renewable technologies are making massive improvements. And I can fully imagine us transitioning to, a post-carbon system in 50, 60, 70 years, or for the most part anyway. You might need 10, 15% nuclear. But that's obviously not quick enough. And so there is an argument to say, well, look, for those experience curves to kick in even more, the experience curve is that you double the production of something, it's the cost of production falls. There's an argument to say, well, we want the experience curves. We believe in these market mechanisms to such an extent, well, actually, we need to accelerate them through quite decisive state intervention, state procurement. I think that's a good argument for the Green New Deal. Because at the moment, I think 2-3% of global energy comes from solar, right? And even if it's like doubling every 2 years, whatever it is, that's clearly not quick enough. So the technology's here, but we need to do this in 25 years, which we have to be honest, the market will not do that.
All right, final question. And it was also a cover story of The Economist, but probably not under your brief.
Yeah.
So, no, don't worry about it if you don't feel that expert on it. Is Juan Guaido the future of Venezuela?
Well, I know that Navarro, certain contributors to Navarro have an analysis of Venezuela, which is not what The Economist would argue about Venezuela. All I do know is that the Maduro regime seems pretty terrible. The question of whether you should replace him undemocratically is definitely beyond my understanding of geopolitics. So I think I'm going to leave it at that.
Aaron?
I think my views on it are quite well documented. I think it's important to say for people in countries in the global north, liberal democracies, we need to have an understanding of what are the limits of impinging on other countries' sovereignty. Clearly, there are conditions. I mean, we can all agree there are conditions where you would want to interfere. Clearly, a genocide, right? The Holocaust. We should have tried to stop. We did try and stop it. We tried our best. The Armenian Holocaust. We regret that could have been averted by. That there are clearly legitimizing sort of factors to explain it. Are those conditions present in Venezuela? I would say they aren't. I would say that Venezuela, even if it's economically mismanaged, it's hyperinflation, all these things. And I might have a different explanation as to why that's happening to other people. But even if I was wrong, I don't see how there are arguments for undermining state sovereignty.
There's a very funny private eye thing that you may have seen last week about this.
No.
Which is, basically comparing Maduro to Theresa May, saying like, you're deliberately impoverishing the country. No one wants you to stay.
Yeah.
You're refusing to leave. You're in your bunker. You don't talk to anyone.
Yeah.
Like I said, very funny. I recommend it.
Yeah, well, it's like, imagine if Norway all of a sudden produced this like super weapon and they became like a military hegemon for whatever reason, even though they've got like 6 million people. And they said, wow, you've misallocated all the funding, all the funds you had from North Sea oil. You've got 14 million people very low who are in relative poverty. You've got millions of people using food banks. We're going to replace your government because it doesn't have our values, right? I mean, we would say, well, that's ridiculous. Clearly, that's absurd. And I look at the sort of the US interfering in Venezuela. I look at the US as a very dysfunctional polity. I see that as a kind of actually broadly quite similar, quite analogous.
How would you feel about the US like airdropping aid supplies into Venezuela? And just let's say there's no subtext. It's just that. How would you feel about that?
Well, I mean, they can do what they like. I mean,
would you support it?
I wouldn't support it. I mean, I would say that it's part of a broader strategy of sort of a colour revolution. But they can do it. I mean, it's not violent, is it?
Yeah.
They can do it. I mean, it's fair play to them in a way. It's like with the BBC exercising soft power the Foreign and Commonwealth Office exercising soft power through the BBC. Every great power does it. Like, there's nothing strange about it. Which it's why I get angry when Brits get angry like Russia doing it. It's like, Britain's been doing this really well for a really long time.
All right, let's end it there. That was a very enjoyable conversation. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
I want us to debate the financial press more often.
They're too discreet and intelligent. We need the right-wing wackos.
All right. Thank you for watching Tiski Sour. Thank you, Callum. Thank you, Aaron. And I'm going to say the same thing I always say at the end to make this possible. Please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you already do, thank you very much. You are what makes this possible. As ever, please like this video. It means it appears in more people's YouTube feeds. Share it on Twitter. Share it on Facebook. And see you next week. Good night.